For 8, 14, and 15, we talked about the Holocaust. A very serious topic, but many people seem to be very interested in it. Um, if people already know so much, there's so many great movies, films that people have seen and are aware of, and all of this. Why then, in an already packed school year, do we take time to study this? There's a few reasons, at least from my perspective. First, if we only look at the movies, if we only have sort of a general understanding, that's not really a fully historical point of view. Another reason that comes up quite often is people saying, well, if we don't study it, we will repeat the same mistakes. So then, does that mean by sitting in history class and taking these notes that bad things will stop happening around the world? Probably not. But hopefully what happens is that by learning about these events and the reason they happened and the people who made them happen, that in your own world, in our own community, in our own country, that you start becoming more aware of injustice. And that, unlike so many people in Germany and Central Europe in the 1940s, that rather than staying silent, that you do something about it. Another reason from my perspective is it's very easy in wars and tragedies like this that things get boiled down into numbers and dates and facts. With the Holocaust, the number we hear so frequently is 6 million, that there are 6 million Jews who were killed. And this is true, but to only use a number is to continue Hitler's plan of looking at these people, not as people, but as a mass of insects or a nuisance or an inhuman, inferior people. So we need to remember that these were millions and millions of individuals created in the image of God, that they had families, that they fought with their brothers and sisters, they went to school and hated taking notes, that we need to honor them by not forgetting them. That for so many of these people who, in Hitler's attempt to wipe them from the face of the earth, he truly did eliminate so many people, and it would be an injustice and a disservice to their memory if we didn't remember them. So some of the things we've already talked about in this unit, starting in the 30s, we can already see Hitler's plans coming to fruition. When he established his Dachau in 1933, it's primarily for political purposes. Of course, there were some Jews who were included in that, possibly because they were socialists, or maybe they had, for some reason or another, been a political prisoner. Then in 1935, the Nuremberg Laws, which there was already, then in 1935, the Nuremberg Laws, in Germany, there's already quite a bit of anti-Semitism, dislike of the Jews. But these laws make it legal, takes away their citizenship, essentially, makes it very difficult for them to make a living. But really, historically, the first major event of the Holocaust is considered November 9th, 1938. We call this Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Throughout Germany and Austria, there is this widespread violence against Jews. And it must have been planned, it must have been coordinated, because it would be uncanny or very, very strange that these events would happen simultaneously throughout such a large area. So what happened is Nazis began attacking Jewish homes, Jewish businesses. You can see there all of the shattered glass of the storefronts. They tried to attack, burn down as many synagogues as possible. And it wasn't like this was a huge secret. It wasn't completely hidden that these communities or these sections of Germany and Austria had been attacked. Here is the front page of the New York Times. So it was well known that something was going on, but you can also see here Goebbels calls halt, that, that the Nazis are bringing control back into Germany, preventing further violence against Jews. Now, we saw this also with the Armenian genocide, where it's reported in the papers and nobody really does anything. Because in 1938, in the fall of 1938, most of Europe is fearing a war, getting ready for a war. So this is just one of many other things that's going on, and nobody really does anything or says anything about it. What happened was that thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. And here we see just at Dachau from Kristallnacht, the men who were arrested. There were some who were killed in some of the violence. And this will begin sort of the clear line of demarcation when this widespread violence against the Jews begins. So the war progressed. There had been a number of attempts to eliminate Jews since 1938. And we're going to fast forward to 1942. Germans are noted for their organization, their engineering, and at the Wannsee Conference, the Nazi leaders are meeting to discuss what they'll call the final solution to the Jewish question. Using such a euphemism like that, it doesn't sound like it's anything bad necessarily, just we need to organize what's going to happen. There are so many Jews in Europe at this time, and by 1942, the Nazis control the majority of Europe. And the main goal of the Wannsee Conference was to organize registration, transportation, and elimination of Europe's Jews. This will be characteristic of the Nazis, is this planning, this order and decorum in a way, in how they will conduct this violence. By 1942, the Nazis have been in power for 9 years. Yes, there have been some Jews who have been killed, either just through street violence, they've been put in camps, and there's also quite a few who have emigrated, who have left Germany. They could see the writing on the wall. They realized they did not want to stay in this country, even though it was their home. So we have 90,000 who go to America. We have over 80,000 who go to South America. We have many who go to Palestine, which makes sense, especially considering that Jerusalem is there. And even some who go to Shanghai, and still to this day there's a very small Jewish community left in China. But then if you look at that inset, nearly 100,000 who leave Germany just for neighboring countries like the Netherlands or Belgium or France. So that's in the case of the Frank family, as in the Diary of Anne Frank. They left Germany for Netherlands. So that's as of 1940. But then, by summer of 1940, Germany has taken over all of those locations. So once again, those German Jews who thought they had fled to safety are back under this dictatorial regime. So by summer of 1940, these German Jews who had escaped Nazi power are once again subject to those same unfair, unequal, racist laws. In 1942, the war's been going on for essentially 2 years. Hitler has attempted and failed at invading Great Britain. He has been fighting in North Africa for a year and a half, trying to hold on to those resources. And he is preparing to invade Russia and take over the rest of Eastern Europe. Now, the reason Germany wanted all of this extra space was to essentially dispose of all of these unwanted peoples. It's called the Hunger Plan, and he was thinking that if he could take the territory, he could then, sort of like a trash dump, take the unwanted people from the center of Germany, export them to the outskirts, and use them as labor. The natives, or the local people, let's say, if this was Russia or Poland, they would die. And also the Jews would be used as forced labor, as farmers to provide agriculture to send back to Germany. And it would just be, they would die off, and this is how they would eliminate the Jews. So that is the ultimate goal. But until that happens, they're going to need to start doing something else, because there are, at the time, the Germans estimated that there were still 11 million Jews left in Europe to deal with. They needed to find that final solution. So the first step of their plan is to use the Einsatzgruppen, which are part of the SS, so they're part of the elite. They are highly trained, and the SS will really be the ones who carry out the majority of the final solution. They are death squads. They would often go town to town or village to village and round up the Jews. And oftentimes their neighbors would say, oh, their Jews are 2 doors down. Take them away. Because these people are terrified. They don't want to cause problems. They don't want to be injured or harmed or taken away by the Germans. So they give up their neighbors. Now, while I understand that completely as human nature, there was an opportunity for people to stand up and say no. It was a big risk, but oftentimes people were silent. Once the Einsatzgruppen would gather all the Jews, they would usually take them to the outskirts of town, have the men dig ditches, and then they would shoot them. Now, while this worked for a little while, it's actually quite inefficient. It's quite costly. There's a lot of bullets, a lot of soldiers that will take to enact that plan and get rid of 11 million Jews. So the Germans will be looking for a more efficient, streamlined, scientific process in order to eliminate Europe's Jews. One way they do that is by establishing the ghettos. You can see on this map, the majority of the ghettos are in the eastern part of Europe, outside of the heart of Germany. So this is trying to start enacting that hunger plan, transporting the Jews out of the heart of Germany. The original purpose is to separate the Jews from the normal population, from the good population. Just let's centralize them so it's easier to deal with them. So they would round up smaller communities, and then they would often sort of block off city streets. So these are urban centers often. In the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, the city's population at the time was 1/3 Jewish. And all of the Jewish population was herded into about 1.5 miles square, and it was blocked. There were barricades put up, there were walls put up, and it would often be very heavily populated. In class, we read through a section of Elie Wiesel's Night, and they said it was an inconvenience, and many of our family members came and lived with us, but that often the Jews felt this was an improvement, that they were, as Elie Wiesel said, entirely among themselves. They could create now their own society apart from the Germans, and they wouldn't have to deal with all of that hostility. And they created their own society, their own police force, their own healthcare system with the limited resources that they had. So we have lots of examples of people in the Jewish community who are essentially cooperating with the Germans because they see that cooperation leads to survival. If you look at the history of the Jewish people, with all of the oppression they have been subjected to, they have learned in centuries that cooperation means survival, and that's better than the alternative. So in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, we have the Jewish population living in this very contained space for years. That was not the norm. It usually was a matter of months, and as the process becomes more streamlined and more efficient, it would only be just a few weeks. So as the surrounding community's Jews are brought into a central location, they'd be there for a while until transportation could be arranged. Then they would take all of their belongings. They would be packed into essentially cattle cars, sometimes 200 people to a train car, still carrying their belongings. And all of this would be with the cooperation of the Jewish police. In class, we watched the clips from The Pianist, and we see the people being loaded into the trains, and one of the men being pulled out and saved because his friend realized the people who go on the trains aren't coming back. The Germans had been telling the Jews, well, first of all, they were cut off from the outside world as they were put into the ghettos. So they're not hearing news from elsewhere. And then the Germans would tell the Jewish communities that they are being sent to be resettled in the East. They're being transported to work camps out on the East. They'll be able to reestablish their communities, so take as much of your belongings as you can, and we'll go from there. The other clip we watched in class from the pianist was the example of the random killings of some of the Jewish workers in the ghetto. With some of the larger ghettos, as neighborhoods would be liquidated, then that gave the opportunity for more Jews from other communities to be brought in. The Germans used Jewish labor to maintain the walls, to do other labor. And as many of you asked in class, why didn't they fight back? It's a wonderful question. Why didn't they fight back? And this is the issue with the Warsaw Ghetto. The Jews in Warsaw had been put in the ghetto in essentially 1940. There was almost 500,000 Jews just from the city of Warsaw. There is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but it only takes place after almost 400,000 of those Jews have been deported. They have been transported. The Jews, again, they had learned over centuries that cooperation led to survival. When they finally have to accept the truth that this cooperation is not leading to survival, that no one is coming back, we haven't heard from anyone, that is when they fight back. And the Germans also very specifically tried to maintain calm, tried to keep up this ruse that it was just resettlement. This is a very famous photograph from the Warsaw Ghetto. We do not know who this little boy is. We never learned his name. But this photo perfectly sort of encapsulates what the ghettos might have been like in the liquidation, that they first have been taken from their homes and their normal communities, and then they resettle in the ghetto, and once again are removed from the ghetto, and then they would be transported to the camps. Now the camps, it would have been purely out of sort of geography. Whichever ghetto they were put in, they would be sent to a camp close in proximity. So for example, the Jews from Warsaw were primarily sent to Treblinka. The Jews from Hungary primarily sent to Auschwitz, and so on. As they were transported to the camps, it could take a day or two, it could take up to a week. They had very little water, no food, no fresh air. When the train would stop to refuel, the SS guards would open the doors of the train and ask for all of the dead bodies to be pushed out. Now with the camps, there is a difference. We've talked about this before, and I just want to re-emphasize this, that there were concentration and work camps. We talked about the concentration camp at Dachau. Another example would be Mauthausen in Austria. Again, mostly political prisoners who were working in a quarry. And again, the Nazis are using this intimidation, fear tactics, and also humiliation to make sure that a small group of guards can control a large prisoner population. So in this case, at the rock quarry, when the prisoners would be climbing up these stairs, holding these giant blocks of stone, the SS officer would push one down at the top of the stairs, who would then tumble down, killing everyone as they all fell, and they were crushed by these stones. So here we can see sort of the hunger plan, using these prisoners for labor, and because there's so many of them, it's not a tragedy if they die. In fact, that's the plan. Then there's the Camp Theresienstadt, which doesn't quite fit into any other molds. By this time, the rest of the world has started asking Germany, okay, where are you sending the Jews? You say you are resettling them, where's the evidence? So organizations like the International Red Cross send in inspectors, and Theresienstadt, in the current Czech Republic, it had been a Habsburg fortress town, so it's a very enclosed space already. And this was almost a fake camp. Now, it's certainly people died, There are absolutely horrific things that happened there. But the purpose of the camp was propaganda, to convince the Red Cross inspectors that this is what resettlement looked like. The prisoners were encouraged to write postcards back to their loved ones in other ghettos saying, we've settled here, things are pretty good, can't wait to see you. There were beautifully equipped bathrooms with showers and faucets and large sinks, ample bunks. There was a community orchestra, and all of this was for show, to convince the rest of the world and to convince the Germans that this is what was happening to the people. Not that they were being murdered, but that they were being resettled. And what often happened is the Jews at Theresienstadt would eventually be sent on to Auschwitz. So Auschwitz is the most well-known extermination camp. It was built a few years into the war, after many other camps had sort of started these processes, and Auschwitz is the example of the peak of German efficiency. You can see that the train tracks lead right into the camp, and Auschwitz is located in southern Poland. Auschwitz is the death camp, and Birkenau is the work side of the camp. When the trains would arrive, the cars would be opened, the doors would be open, they would be unloaded, and the prisoners would still be holding on to their luggage. They would be separated, men and women, and they would often be told to place their luggage in a secure location so they could get it later. And then another level of selection would also be with doctors. They are looking for able-bodied, healthy workers who could be sent into the work camp. But if you were old, young children, ill, pregnant women, they would immediately be sent into the gas chambers. Dr. Joseph Mengele was an SS doctor. He is the famous Dr. Death who led all of the scientific experiments on the inmates at Auschwitz. Some of his experiments included amputating limbs and attaching someone else's limbs to see if it would take. Miscellaneous tests with reproductive organs, trying to turn brown eyes blue. All of this was an attempt to see if outside of normal procreation with a man and a woman resulting in a child, was there a way to scientifically create the Aryan race? To take this nuisance of a people and turn them into the ideal of the Aryans. Some inmates actually volunteer and wanted to be part of this medical testing because it meant that they stayed alive longer. They got better housing, they had better food. But these tests were incredibly cruel, and using science, using modern technology and understanding of nature for entirely evil purposes. One thing that I find fascinating about Mengele is he was never found after the war. There are many Nazis who are able to escape. There were rumors that he escaped to South America, and one theory is that he was successfully able to sort of create wider tests in creating the master race. There is a small village in the heart of Brazil that has been discovered, and it is primarily blonde-haired, blue-eyed sets of twins. Now, twins are very important for Mengele's experiments. One, you could have a test subject and a control subject, but also he was interested in twins from the reproductive standpoint, that if every German Aryan mother could give birth to twins or triplets, how much more effective would that be in building the Aryan race? So some people think he escaped to South America and was able to start building this master race. Those who were selected for extermination would be sort of marshaled into the gas chambers. Often they were told that they were showers, which would have been proper in the Jewish tradition to have these ritualistic baths. There were even shower heads hanging from the ceiling often. Then the doors would be sealed. And the Germans had started using a chemical product called Zyklon B. At first they had tried using carbon monoxide from engine exhaust, but again they wanted to be more streamlined, more efficient. Zyklon B was originally used as a pesticide, and a large-scale pesticide for agricultural purposes, getting rid of bugs, large weeds, things like that. In an open area like a field like that, any of the dangerous gases would dissipate with a little bit of protection. But in an enclosed space, the gases that would come from these pellets would cause asphyxiation. So the SS officers would close the doors, put in these pellets through a vent, and would take anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes for all of the people inside to die. At Auschwitz, the gas chambers could fit up to 2,000 people. Asphyxiation is a very slow death. There are stories that people could hear the screams. There are some gas chambers where there are finger scratches on the walls visible. But part of the reason the Germans had done this, if you think back to the Einsatzgruppen and the inefficiency of using all of those bullets, there also is the issue of the emotional toll it would take on the guards. So this way, the SS officers and the Germans don't have to personally feel that they are killing these Jews. It will take less of a toll on them. Then once everyone in the chambers has died, then other Jews who have been cooperating with the Germans take over. They were known as the Sonderkommando, or the Walking Dead. They got better housing and better food. So again, this idea of survival. Their job was to then take out all of the corpses and begin digging large pits, mass graves. Once the Germans realize how many bodies there would be, they decide that that is inefficient. It also leaves too much of a trace, which is why they start using crematoria to burn the bodies, to leave as little evidence as possible. Now, this is what is so odd about the Germans, that they kept detailed records. They took photographs of so many of these camps so they could replicate them in the future. But they also tried to cover up what they were doing, as we see with Theresienstadt, we see with the crematoria. Even with this, though, it would have been very difficult if you were in the surrounding area to not know that this was going on. Sometimes these crematoria would burn 24 hours a day, and that's a very distinctive smell. I mean, you think of if you happen to get too close to a campfire or you singe your hair on a candle, that has a very distinct smell. So that is just a fraction of what it might have been like with these corpses being burned all day long. And this was, again, done by other Jewish prisoners. When the Americans and British are coming from the west into Germany, and we have the Soviets coming from the east, closing in on Berlin, they had heard about some of this violence against the Jews. They had guesses. They had a couple eyewitness reports, but they really didn't understand the extent of what had been going on. And this is when we watched the clip from Band of Brothers. What happened in a few cases, as the camps were liberated, that the soldiers were just so appalled, so outraged, especially at the people who lived in the surrounding villages, that they didn't do anything, that they didn't stand up and say, no, this is wrong. Again, this idea we've talked about integrity and speaking up when something is wrong. In some cases, the soldiers forced the townspeople to come and dig proper graves for all of these people who had been left for dead. As the Germans realized they were losing and they began retreating, they tried to do as much damage as possible. So in the video clip, it explains that they tried to light some of the huts on fire, shoot as many of the inmates, and then when they were out of ammo, they simply locked the gates and left. In the case of Auschwitz, they went on forced marches. This was in January and February 45. They marched the prisoners all day and all night through the snow as the Soviet army was approaching. So still trying to hide their deeds from the outside world, while at the same time continuing to kill as many Jews as possible. When these people are liberated, there must have been such relief and such joy, but also quite a bit of sorrow. The task of finding homes for these people, for reuniting them with their families, trying to decide where they will live. So many Jews didn't feel that they could return to their homes, return to the neighbors that had given them up, reestablish themselves in a society that had betrayed them. So the Holocaust really provides a very compelling argument for why the Jews still, we talked about Zionism, this really is again a resurgence of the discussion of a national Jewish home. It is nearly impossible to bring justice to such a horrific situation, but the world does attempt it with the Nuremberg trials. Nuremberg was the place where the laws had been passed that had started this discrimination and violence against the Jews. With the Nazis that they are able to track down, who are living, who don't die in battle or commit suicide, there is this international trial. Here we have Hermann Goering, who is probably like the number 3 or 4 officer in the Nazi Party, in all of Nazi Germany. And these people are put on trial, accused of crimes against humanity, of mass murder, and those who are found guilty are hanged or put in prison for life. It is just one tiny drop in the ocean of bringing justice to such a massive issue. And when we talk about the Holocaust, we really do talk about the 6 million Jews. But it's very important to remember that there are an additional 6 million people who were killed through this process. The Soviet prisoners of war, the mentally and physically disabled, the Roma or the Gypsy communities, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals. The Holocaust really is the perfect, horrible example of what happens when man thinks he is superior, that he can interfere with God's work and use science for such evil purposes.